Hey folks, today we're going to be talking about some of the things that we should be thinking about as we enter our discussion of literacy for the next couple of weeks. So we're going to talk about literacy and literacy sponsors and tie into the intro of the chapter and really the beginning parts of the Deborah Brandt essay. So the chapter establishes that their discussion of literacy is really grounded in this threshold concept that writing is impacted by identity and experience. And so part of the conversation in the field of writing studies around this particular issue is to ask questions such as what is literacy? What does it mean to be a literate individual? How has our understanding of what counts as literacy changed over time? What shapes that definition of literacy? What would it mean to think in terms of literacies or of literacy as plural? How do we acquire our literacies? And how do our experiences, particularly our early literacy experiences, shape our current relationships with producing and consuming text? So, for example, the kinds of text we choose to read or write, and our sense of who we are as readers and writers. So one of the central assumptions of the field is that literacy doesn't just happen by itself, which brings us to Deborah Brandt's piece on literacy sponsors. And the notion is that the acquisition of literacy is supported by others, whether that's individuals or larger institutions. And tied to that is the notion that sponsorship is not neutral, that different sponsors and different literacies have their own values, and therefore sponsors have their own motivations. And so that means that the sponsors of our literacy, those who support it, again, either individuals or institutions, aren't necessarily motivated simply out of goodwill or a sense that they're trying to do some kind of public service. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the article. So in the introduction, we're going to begin with Brandt providing a story tied to literacy. From there, she's going to establish what we, in this case the field, already know. So in this case, she's going to argue that our field understands individual literacy development really well. But from there, she's going to establish what we don't know. In particular, how larger social forces shape that development, right? So she's going to argue that the field understands individual development, but doesn't have a great understanding of how larger forces shape that development. And in particular, she's going to call our attention to things like economic, cultural, and technological forces. So there are a lot of others that might be in play as well. She's then going to explain why we want to know what we don't know. And for her, it's because in her framework, she's going to talk about literacy as a commodity. And so she wants to argue that if we understand literacy as a commodity, that is going to open up a large number of new ways of thinking about issues that are tied to the broader study of literacy. From there, she'll talk a little bit about her methods. So in her case, her methods are primarily a large number of interview work that took place over multiple years. So she interviewed a very, very large number of people in order to get a broader sense of how literacy has impacted people's lives. She'll lay out some of her goals. One goal is really insights into the bigger picture around literacy, but also implications for teaching. In the body of the essay, right, in the body of her article, she's going to divide into a number of sections. So she'll start by defining her central term, which is that of sponsorship, right? So the idea of literacy sponsorship. And from there, she'll kind of focus her essay around 3 points of discussion. The first is that even in a democratic society, access to literacy and its rewards is uneven. She'll then talk about the concept of a literacy crisis and how it is essentially produced in part by those who are responsible for sponsoring literacy. And when we talk about a literacy crisis, this is sort of when people kind of go on and on about the idea that, oh, kids today can't read, or kids today can't write, or, texting is ruining writing, or TikTok is ruining writing, whatever the current sort of major form of communication is. Finally, she'll talk a little bit about how sponsorship can, in a number of cases, be creatively subverted. And so to do that, she's going to start with some case studies about access and look at two individuals who grew up in the same time and place and had access to different kinds of literacy and what the implications of that might be. She will look at another case study that discusses how standards of what counts as literacy shift over time in response to a number of social forces. And then she'll wrap up with 2 case studies on how individuals are able to subvert the literacy sponsorship that they have received to their own ends and to their own personal development. Finally, she'll wrap up with a discussion of teaching and the implications for her study with respect to teaching. Before we go any further, let's just hit a couple of key terms before I send you off for the reading. So first, she's going to talk a little bit about literacy, and so really we need to think about what does it mean to be literate? How do you personally define the notion of literacy, and what factors have shaped that definition, and are there other ways of considering it, right? So we often think about literacy in terms of like the ability to read or write, but Brandt's going to push us to think about that a little bit harder. Again, literacy sponsor, so someone who is involved in or has played a role in helping you develop the skills that you associate with your literacy or literacies. And again, that could be an individual, it could be a group of individuals, it could be a larger institution like a school or a church or even a business. Another concept that she introduces that's a little bit difficult to wrap our heads around is the notion of ideological freight, which she talks about on page 240. And she argues that sponsors deliver the ideological freight that must be borne for access to what they have. So to put that into more simple terms to help you with your reading, the notion here is that when your literacy is sponsored by someone or some institution, um, that sponsorship comes with some strings attached, and some of those strings can include, for example, the values of the person or institution doing the sponsorship. So I think a simple example to look at would be the way that religious churches and schools can sponsor your literacy. But part of the cost of that is the taking up of the values of that religion in the process. So for example, the literacy sponsorship in a Catholic school is always going to be couched within terms tied to the tenets of that faith and the values of that particular institution. And it can be difficult sometimes as you're developing literacy in that context to separate those values from the skills that you're developing. So good luck as you're making your way into the Deborah Brandt piece, and we'll follow up with this throughout the week.